So in today's video, guys, I want to talk about overcoming the problem of the inner critic. How can we overcome the obstacles that are placed in our way on a daily basis that the inner critic reinforces? The best way to try and look at this is to understand first, what is the inner critic? Now, the inner critic, it could be described as that voice in your head, that thing in the back of your mind that is antagonistic and against your pursuits or your desires or your ambitions that are difficult to accomplish. So your inner critic is that voice in your head that basically tells you it's kind of like, in a sense, a lot of people refer to it or visualize it through the metaphor of a demon, right? They say like, interest. And it's the same with like the idea of intrusive thoughts, that there is this thing that is speaking to you that is going against your ambitions, that wants you to deny your sense of self-worth, deny your ability to achieve any form of success or confront any challenge and overcome it, basically. So that would probably be the best way to describe it. And people either experience it through, mostly through thoughts. Certain thoughts come to their mind that causes them to doubt themselves and therefore not take action on what they want to do. Now, one thing we obviously need to do is we need to learn how to take control of the inner critic in some sort of sense. We need to take back control and override it, basically, eliminate it or move beyond it in some sort of sense. Now, I would say that your inner critic's persistence, let's say, in your mind only stems from two key reasons, right? So the inner critic, well, one is personally attached to your ego. So it's attached to your ego, your sense of identity, your sense of self. And the problem is, and the reason why people get stuck with listening to that inner critic or intrusive thoughts that deny or go against their ego's sense of identity, is because they don't know how to detach from their ego to reframe their cognition from a different reference point. And what I mean by that is, or a different point of reference. Obviously, your ego has limitations, right? And those limitations are, you could say, based on your experiences that you've had through your subjective life, right? So you've gone through certain traumas, you've gone through certain pains, certain difficulties, and this is kind of where the inner critic comes from, is that there's trace memories, you could say, that are formed that reinforce forms of self-doubt that come from those experiences of trauma and those memories, right? And that's what the inner critic is reinforcing. Or that voice in the back of your head that is saying, you cannot do this, you won't be able to achieve this, whatever it is. Those thoughts are being consistently produced because you are stuck within the frame of reference of your own ego. So therefore you can't get out of your own ego to look at your life from a completely different perspective so that you can move past the limitations of the inner critic in this sense. So the problem is the person who's struggling with the inner critic is that they find it very difficult to detach from the limitations of their ego, which is the subjective experience, the things of which have caused and created trauma, so that they can go beyond any sense of limitation. So what they need to do is they need to learn how to reframe their perspective on life. And in psychology, you'd call this cognitive reframing, which is to reframe your cognition from a different point of view. Now, one method I like to call, and I try to do this with myself anytime I kind of hit a roadblock when it comes to trying to achieve something, or if I'm hitting a roadblock in relation to being courageous, being ambitious, trying to strive for some sort of good or some sort of thing that, provokes my insecurities, is that I try to look or take myself out of my own ego and look at myself from a completely different perspective that holds no limitation at all. Okay, because if our ego is limited, then we're going to live in a limited sense of reality or perception of our capabilities or of life itself. So through this method, I liked this method of reframing. I like to call it looking from the outside in. So it's you getting your perspective outside of yourself and looking outside of your reality inwards. And the best way you could say of doing this is through a perception or perspective that has no limitation itself. So if you want to go to a place of non-limitation, you want to go to the source, which you could say is that of God, because God is non-limitation. So when you kind of use this kind of visualization method, you want to look at your life from the perspective of how God would perceive you in relation to the properties of God itself. So what are the properties of God that you can look at your life from through this perspective, which would be omnipresence, omnibenevolence, and omnipotence, which is the properties of an all-knowing God, an all-loving God, and an all-good God. And through this perception or perspective, you can embrace those properties so that you do not become stuck by any limited thoughts, any limited beliefs, any cognitive distortions, any intrusive thoughts that your ego is creating to keep you stuck within a box of your own subjective experience of perception, right? So that's where looking at your life from the outside in can become very useful, because you can embrace those properties of what God represents through that meditation or through that prayer with God, which would be omnipresence, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. Because God is all-knowing, all-loving, and all-good. So you embrace that perception of life, that perspective of life within your own situation to get rid of any of these distractions and distortions that you may be maintaining through logical fallacies or cognitive distortions for your subjective sense or perception of reality. And this would be the best way to do it. And now you might be thinking, well, this is maybe kind of a bit, whatever, it sounds a bit weird, right? But really, this is just a traditional description of prayer. In a traditional sense, this is what people would be doing when they're praying. Like if you had certain individuals at church to pray or try and commune with God, that communion with God is basically doing this. They're trying to speak with God, to embrace the properties of God so that they can be directed and be guided in the most affirmative, positive way possible through the properties of God itself. Benevolence, love, and goodness. And this is, you can see this basically in prayer. You can see this in meditation. And of course, you could see this in a more secular psychological description as I'm offering to you right now, which is a visualization method. And this is very useful if you want to basically practice some sort of a visualization method or cognitive reframing method. So you could say that this is basically to practice your relational capacity to commune with God or some sort of higher sense of oneself, so that you can go beyond these feelings of self-doubt within your own life. And then by doing this, you cannot remain stuck and conformed to this kind of fallible nature of ourselves, of our own egos, of our own experiences that include doubt and kind of self-deception that our own egos produce from the pains of kind of different forms of sin, right? And therefore, my perspective is now going to be informed by the image and reference of God's love, God's power, and knowledge for his creation. And this is very much, even if you look into things statistically when it comes to even just the practice of prayer, people who practice prayer, they feel less anxious. They don't experience as much depression as someone who doesn't pray. Or they have less ailments of suffering and mental illness for people who pray than people who don't pray. Because they are in, some people might say, well, this is just a placebo effect. But the end result is that there is a sense of communion with a higher being or a higher sense of reality that is there to guide the individual for a moral axiomatic structure that is going to fulfill the needs of that individual, and therefore they feel more in tune to a higher meaning, a higher purpose in relation to their life. And that's what reduces all of these senses of, these feelings of shame, intrusive thoughts, doubt, anxiousness, depression, whatever it may be. Because they're maintaining a unified connection to a higher source of life. If that is something you wish to practice, I would recommend you look into the kind of the nature or the metaphysical kind of like construction of prayer, meditation, stuff like this, or even just apply what I've been saying here, looking at your life from the outside in, so that you can gain that perspective, so that you're not stuck in perception, and that you have perspective to your life, so that you don't fall into these traps that our egos create from the limited experiences that we have that construct our sense of reality. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, comment your thoughts down below, subscribe, share it around with other people who you might find this video interesting. And of course, if you're interested in any free coaching with regards to overcoming procrastination, working through these problems that I've talked about in this video, then book in that free one-on-one call and we can talk about it and go over some of the fundamental methods and techniques that we'd be working on together to help you solve the problems that you're dealing with. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, comment your thoughts down below, and I'll speak to you in the next one.